So I don't have to tell you that the world has been transformed over the last 20 years by the process of globalization. Different people mean different things by the term globalization. For our purposes, I will mean first the vast increase in trade of goods and services between countries. There's no doubt that there's been an enormous increase in trade, but I will also mean, and this will be actually very important for the theoretical part, the fact that more production is now internationalized. So just to give an anecdotal story, nowadays in most places in the United States, if you pick up the phone and you call your bank, you won't get someone in the local bank. You're likely to get someone in India. There are vast call centers that have been set up in Delhi and other places in India, and those are the people who answer your calls when you call your bank or when you ask for technical assistance with your computer, for a whole range of other services. And they do it very well. They actually probably do it better than the local people who used to do the job. This is just one small aspect of the internationalization of production, and I will come back to that later. Why have we seen such an increase in globalization? Well, most globalizations have been prompted by decreases, and by the way, this is not the first globalization in history. There have been many, and I will talk about some of the others later on. But most globalizations have been caused by declining costs, transport costs, obviously, but also a decline in communication costs. It's now practically costless to communicate with the other side of the world. That was not true 20 years ago, and that decline in communication costs has made a huge difference. There's also been an increase in trade because of the removal of legal or political trade barriers. So we now have more free trade agreements, free trade zones than we did a generation ago. Well, globalization, the proponents of globalization have made many promises on its behalf. One of those promises is to bring prosperity, or greater prosperity, to poor countries. And on that score, it's delivered, at least in many instances. There have been, we've seen a lot of poor countries, China and India are only the most spectacular examples, make enormous strides in average GNP increases. Put another way, GDP per capita. Now, of course, that's not the only way of measuring progress, but it's a standard way. Another promise, though, that globalization has made is that inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, will decline in poorer countries, and on that score, globalization has not done so well. And in fact, more often than not, we've seen increases in inequality in developing countries, and with Here again, we can use China and India as prime examples, although GDP per capita has come a long way in both countries. The dispersion of GDP has also increased dramatically in both places. So we might first ask, well, is this something that economists should worry about? Perhaps you don't need to have motivation for the discussion of why inequality matters, but in case you're not persuaded, let me offer three basic reasons why inequality does matter. The first is a moral argument, the idea that all human beings are in some sense equal. They're equal before the law. They ought to have equal chances in life, and a great deal of the inequality that we have seen is not just reflecting an inequality of outcome, but it's also reflecting an inequality of opportunity. But if you're not persuaded by that, inequality, of course, is connected with poverty, particularly in poor countries. The people who have been left behind by globalization are, in some cases, some of the poorest people in the world. And so even if you don't care about inequality per se, you may care about the fact that there are these desperately poor people who have not seen their welfare improve as a result of globalization. But even if you reject that argument, there's a more practical reason for worrying about inequality, and that is that there's a link, a well-established link between inequality and political instability. If you want your country to hold together, you're not improving matters by allowing the income distribution to get too widely dispersed. So I'm going to take it as given that inequality is something that we would like to reduce, particularly in poor countries, based on at least one of these arguments. Now, as an economic theorist, one first question to ask about what has been happening with inequality is, should we be surprised by the fact that inequality has increased in poor countries? Is this, in some sense, contrary to economic theory, or at least well-established economic theory? And there, I think the answer is yes. There is a sense in which this increase in inequality contradicts what is probably the best established theory of international trade, the theory that has been around the longest and has the most evidence in its favor, and that's the theory of comparative advantage. The modern version of the theory of comparative advantage is the Heckscher-Ohlin model. But the theory goes back more than 200 years. It has been applied over and over again to explain international trade patterns, and by and large it's done a remarkably good job. As we'll see, and I'll come to the details of this argument in a little while, the theory of comparative comparative advantage actually predicts that free trade should reduce inequality in poor countries. There's a very simple argument for that, which I will show you, and therefore, at least according to this theory, the increasing inequality has been surprising. So the theory of comparative advantage, again in its modern version, the Heckscher-Rollin version, attributes differences in countries to their relative factor endowments. So factor endowments are just the basic inputs to production, such as labor, such as land, such as capital. For my purposes today, I'm going to concentrate on labor. That isn't to say that land and capital aren't important, but this is largely a discussion of what is happening to wages and income, and so it seems simplest to concentrate on labor. And so what I'm going to do, at least in the first part of this session, is to assume that there are two kinds of labor. There's high-skilled labor, people who have had a lot of job training or a lot of education, and low-skilled labor, people who have not had those advantages. And to see why the theory of comparative advantage predicts that inequality should go down as a result of globalization, at least in poor countries. What I want to do is to do a thought experiment, or to look at a little model where there are two countries. There's a rich country and there's a poor country. And the reason why the rich country is rich is because it has more human capital. That is, the ratio of high-skilled to low-skilled workers is higher in the rich country as compared with the poor country. That means, from the standpoint of the theory, that the rich country has a comparative advantage in producing goods which require a high skill input. So there are lots of such goods. To fix ideas, let's concentrate on one: computer software. So computer software is a good where most of the labor is really quite high skilled. It consists of people who are computer programmers. The poor country has a comparative advantage producing goods where skill doesn't matter so much. And typically, agricultural goods are an example of such goods. Not always, and in fact, one of the things we've seen in recent years is the development of high-tech agricultural techniques, which do require high-skilled people to implement those techniques. But on the whole, agriculture is not terribly sensitive to skill. And so we'll use rice as an example of a good where the poor country might have a comparative advantage. So to see how globalization affects production and wages, let's look at the pattern of production and the wage pattern before globalization occurs. So for our purposes, in this theory of comparative advantage, what I'll mean before globalization is at a point where there's no trade between the rich country and the poor country. The barriers to trade are just too high. So we'll compare the pre-trade or the no-trade position with what happens after the barriers to trade come down, after free trade becomes possible. And what we'll see is that inequality in the poor country will go down. So let's look at the pre-trade situation first. We'll suppose that, and this seems a very natural assumption, that consumers in the rich country have basically the same aspirations as consumers in the poor country. That is, they want to consume a mix of goods. They want to consume some computer software and some rice, and that's true in the poor country as well. But that means that before international trade is possible, if consumers in the rich country are going to consume both software and rice, producers in the rich country have to produce both of them. And similarly, companies in the poor country have to produce both goods. But there's a sense in which producing software in the poor country is an inefficient use of its labor supply, because the poor country's labor force is better suited, according to the theory, for producing rice. So there's a sense in which low-skilled workers are actually hurt by the production of software in the poor country. These workers are not needed very much for software. They are greatly needed for rice. And so to the extent that production is being diverted away from rice and towards software, that is reducing the demand for low-skilled labor. And at the same time, so that means that there's a downward pressure on low-skilled wages. At the same time, we see that high-skilled workers in the poor country do very well from the fact that software is being produced there. And so they see their wages being pushed up. So that's the situation before globalization occurs. A lot of demand for high-skilled workers, not as much demand for low-skilled workers, as would be the case if there weren't software production. Now, what happens when we open the door to trade between the rich and poor country? Actually, before we open the door, let me make sure that everyone is with me. Are there any questions about what I've said so far? Okay, either this is boring you silly and you've already seen it before, or I've been clear enough so that you've instantly absorbed it. I hope it's the second, but you'll have to tell me. So what happens when we open trade? Well, now the two countries can specialize in the good which is their comparative advantage. So that means that the rich country will shift production from rice to software, and it will import rice from the poor country. The poor country will shift from software to rice. It will import software from the rich country, and now that means that the poor country is producing more rice, less software than before, this raises the demand for low-skilled workers. As I've been saying, they are needed for rice, not so much for software. Now that there's more rice being produced, that puts the low-skilled workers in demand. And at the same time, there's a reduction in the demand for high-skilled workers. There's not as much software being produced. So that fall in demand means that high-skilled workers' wages fall and low-skilled wages rise. And that means that there's been a decline in inequality. So what I've just shown you is the standard argument that is given for why globalization should lead to falls in inequality, at least in poor countries. And this is what the leading proponents of globalization were saying 20 years ago. Things didn't entirely turn out this way, and that's what I want to get into in a few minutes. But are there any questions about the standard argument? Well, as I said at the beginning, the theory of comparative advantage has been a very successful theory. And in a number of other periods of globalization, the theory has done very well. So there was a very significant globalization, for example, at the end of the 19th century. Before then, trade between Europe and North America was limited by the fact that it was really very expensive to get goods across the ocean. But there were some important advances in shipbuilding toward the end of the 19th century. It became much cheaper to send goods across the ocean in both directions. And it became faster to do so. And that led to a very significant increase in trade.
Can you just quickly clarify, because so if comparative advantage exists, then two trading partners can be off by trading, or better off by trading.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that within the trading partner countries, inequality, how that wealth is distributed is an issue of social policy, right, rather than just pure economic. So is the argument that inequality is not narrowing even within the trading partners, or just globally amongst the population? Because I don't think there's a necessary consequence for narrowing of inequality just purely out of comparative advantage.
I did give you an argument for why comparative advantage should be expected to reduce inequality in the relatively poor country. If two countries are trading with one another,
oh, right. Okay.
and one of them is poorer than the other, we can expect, because of concentration in the goods which are those countries' comparative advantage, that inequality in the poor country will go down. Now, what I didn't talk about here was that we can also expect the GDP per capita to rise in both countries. That's why they trade, because on average people are better off. But that doesn't mean that everybody's better off. That's a statement about averages. And we see here that according to the theory of the comparative advantage, it's the skilled people in the poor country who are actually hurt by globalization, or maybe hurt by it.
And I just now recall that you've assumed we're focusing on wages, so you're looking for the right.
A particular characteristic that you observe nowadays is there's brain gain as well as brain drain.
Right.
And I believe so because we have still a lot of disparities even in Europe, even in pretty rich countries. I believe there's even a race to the bottom for this pretty poor countries which they have a lot of high-skilled labor, but maybe because of the shift, this high-skilled labor migrates, right? So in this case, the disparities might become even worse.
That's right. That's right. Although, despite brain drains and brain gains, there have not, at least not yet, been there's not yet been enough immigration and emigration to make a difference to the macro figures.
I'm sorry, could you keep the microphone closer to the mouth? I think some people are having trouble
Oh,
hearing.
sure,
Thank
sure.
you.
Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought I saw another hand or two. There's plenty more opportunity. Yes.
Yeah. Given that in the standard Heck-Shirley model, which is I think what you're using here, we do predict like complete specialization, which is obviously empirically untrue. So don't you think you're overstating the success of the theory of comparative advantage?
Sure I am. So there are modifications, important modifications, involving increasing returns to scale of production, which do not lead to this extreme prediction, but qualitatively, even those modifications still predict the decline in inequality in poor countries. Now, I was starting to talk about the 19th century globalization. So what I'm presenting here is qualified by all the usual qualifications you have to make about a piece of economic history. But what I am confident of is that this is a pretty widely held view among economic historians. I'm not an economic historian myself, but I'm relying on them to say that at that time, Europe had the relative abundance of low-skilled labor. North America, in particular the U.S., had a relative abundance of high-skilled labor. Trade increased dramatically, and inequality fell in Europe, and at the same time rose in the United States, which is just what the simple theory predicts. So there certainly have been cases of globalizations where the theory does pretty well, or seems to do pretty well. But as I said at the outset, it hasn't done so well for this most recent globalization in at least two respects. So if you take the Heckscher-Ohlin theory seriously, and there's good reason to take it seriously, you would expect that the greater the difference between two countries in their factor endowment ratios, the more trade we should expect to see between those countries, because the more potential gains from trade we would expect those countries to want to realize. But empirically, that prediction seems to be pretty problematic. For example, Africa, where we see some of the very poorest countries in the world, are not trading significantly with the rich industrialized countries. I mean, the trade has increased a bit, but not nearly on the level that India or China have. And yet, their skill ratios are the ones most different from the rich countries of the world. So that's a prediction which hasn't worked. And then the main prediction that I want to concentrate on is the prediction that inequality should go down. So it was primarily observation 2 that motivated Michael Kramer and me to develop an alternative theory, or it should be thought of as a supplement. We're not proposing to throw comparative advantage out, but we want to supplement it with what we think is the most notable feature of the most recent globalization, or at least the feature that distinguishes it from previous globalizations. And that's that globalization recently has meant the internationalization of production. So I gave this little example of calling your bank and getting someone in India. That's just a little example, but there are some big examples. To take computers, for example. Computers are a great example of goods that are produced internationally. They might be designed in the US or thought up in the US and then programmed in Europe and then assembled in China. And this is true of a vast range of other goods, that the production process is highly international, and that turns out to make a big difference. So for this alternative theory, we need more than 2 skill levels. In the paper itself, there's a large number of skill levels, a continuum, in fact. For my purposes today, it will suffice to have 4 skill levels. And we're going to think of production as, the production process consists of different tasks. So what does a company do? It puts together people who are performing different tasks. Again, typically there will be many tasks that are performed in a company, but for our purposes, we only have to have 2. There's a managerial task in which skill is important. That is, output from the managerial task will be highly sensitive to skill. And there's another task, which I'll call the subordinate task, where productivity is less sensitive to skill. Once again, it'll be helpful to focus on just 2 countries, a rich country and a poor country. The rich country, we'll suppose, has workers of skill levels A and B. So there'll be 4 skill levels, A, B, C, and D. The rich country has the most skilled workers, A and B. The poor country has the lower skilled workers, C and D, where we're assuming this inequality, this series of inequalities. Actually, everything I say will continue to hold if C is bigger than B. Now, this assumption is clearly an oversimplification. Of course, even in very poor countries, there are always some highly skilled workers, some A workers, and even in even in rich countries, there are some workers without much in the way of skills, some C or D workers. So this is meant to be an approximation rather than something which you take literally. But that's what models are anyway. They are simplifications. And the results are robust to making things more realistic.
Is it that skill level A in the rich country and skill level C in the poor country are the similar skill required to produce similar goods?
Okay, so I haven't talked about what goods are produced. In fact, another great simplification I'm going to make is that there's only one good in this world economy. Because for our purposes, the differences between goods will not be important. So the answer to your question is yes. We're implicitly assuming that if you're highly skilled, there are lots of goods you could produce, or at least lots of goods you could produce with a little bit of additional training. And actually the same is true of low-skilled workers, but low-skilled workers just won't be as productive as high-skilled workers. So all of this is going to be captured by the assumption that there's only one good in this world economy. And another simplification we get out of that assumption is we don't have to worry about trade. If there's only one good produced, there's nothing to trade. And so the whole emphasis of the model will not be on trade, but on production. Yes?
For clarifying, do you define wealth of countries only based on the workers that they have or capital? Is it also
In this model, it's only labor. So labor is the only source of income.
Everything else is equal in the two countries.
Of course it's not. Of course it's not. But actually, if we had capital, that would only aggravate the situation. We know, again, from a lot of empirical evidence that the recent technological changes have tended to increase the productivity of high-skilled workers because they're using newer technology and to relatively reduce the productivity of low-skilled workers. So if we introduced capital in a realistic way in this model, we would only make the effects that I'm talking about even bigger. Right. So we're right. Absolutely. Of course. So there are some very high-skilled workers, even in poor countries. For my purposes, there are not enough of them to make a difference. Yeah. So suppose we divided up the economy into two groups, roughly speaking. Each economy is going to be divided up into two groups, and roughly speaking, in the rich country, the groups are A and B, and in the poor country, they're C and D. In the full paper, we'll have some distribution in each country, but the peak in the rich country will be to the right or actually in this case to the left of the peak in the forecountry. Yeah.
One of the reasons why Hexaoland is criticized more or less is due to a publication in, I believe, 1953, which became known as the Oxford Paradox. And it's still questionable whether the results hold for the US, but he also has proven that this model actually does not hold at all for Japan at this time, because they should have exported more, less labor-intensive products and more technological intensive products.
Right.
So by refraining from modeling both sides of labor and capital, do you think we can tackle this issue, or maybe it's still to deal with this issue at the same time?
Well, I mean, I also launched an attack, in a sense, on Hexaoland, and I'm not denying that there might be ways of patching it up to fit the recent facts better, but I rather doubt that that can be done in a convincing way. Certainly, introducing capital, as I was saying a moment ago, is not going to help. It's actually going to make things worse. So what we've preferred to do is to drop Hexaoland, or rather to supplement it with another model which doesn't rely on the composition of the goods you trade, because there's going to be, in this alternative model, there's not going to be any trade at all. There will be international production, but no trade. So we feel that this alternative model has some real empirical promise. Of course, that remains to be seen, but we have some reason for hope. So I said that a production process consists of two different tasks, a managerial task and a subordinate task, and output is created or produced by taking workers, and each firm, each company is going to consist of two workers, one occupying the managerial role and one occupying the subordinate role. So firms are extremely simple in this model. They're just two worker firms, and nothing relies crucially on that, but the analysis is very simple. And the amount of output you get by matching a manager with a subordinate depends on the skill levels of the workers who have those jobs. So this comes back to a question before. We're supposing that a worker of a given skill level can produce any good. In this model, there's just one good, but that's getting at the idea that that workers in principle can produce any good. And we'll suppose that output, that we can write output as a particular formula, m squared s. So M is the skill level of the manager. S is the skill level of the subordinates. Why are we squaring the manager's skill? That's to get across the idea that the manager's skill has a bigger impact on output, or output is more sensitive to the manager's skill than to the subordinate skill. There's no particular reason why this has to be 2, it could be a 3, it could be a 3 halves. That doesn't make much difference. At least in the theory, it would certainly, if you were empirically estimating this, you would want to estimate this coefficient, which doesn't have to be 2.
So skill levels are greater than 1.
Sorry?
Skill levels are greater than 1, right? Greater than 1.
What is greater than 1?
Skill levels.
Yes, skill levels are greater than 1. That's right. We've normalized all skills to be greater than 1. Right. That just is a matter of units. So, for example, if the manager's skill were 4 and the subordinate skill were 3, then the output would be 4 squared, 4 times 4 times 3, or 48. Now, we'll suppose that there are lots of firms. Each firm is small, it just has 2 workers, and there are many firms and many potential workers. It's a competitive labor market. So that means that each worker is going to be paid his or her marginal product. But in equilibrium, the marginal product of a worker will depend on how workers are matched. So let me make that point by looking at an example. So suppose we had a labor force that consisted of exactly 4 workers. There were 2 workers of skill level 3, and there were two workers of skill level 4. Now there are 2 ways that these 4 workers could be matched. We could have what I'll call cross-matching, where a 4 worker is matched with a 3 worker, the other 4 worker is matched with the other 3 worker. That would lead to a total output of 96, 48 plus 48. Or we could have what I'll call homogeneous matching or self-matching, where the 4 worker is matched with the other 4 worker, the 3 worker is matched with the other 3 worker. That leads, in this case, to output 91. Now, I've assumed that the labor market is competitive. There's only one good. That means that the only possible equilibrium given this labor pool is this one, because competition will maximize outputs. So for this labor market, we'll see cross-matching. But that's not always, we won't always see cross-matching. It'll depend on the what workers are available. So here's another example. Suppose we had a labor market which consisted of two workers and 2 4 workers. So I've reduced the skill level of the lower skilled workers relative to the previous example. We could have, once again, cross-matching. Cross-matching in this case leads to total output 64. Or we could have homogeneous matching, which in this case, you can do the math, leads to output 72. So here we have homogeneous matching. Or self-matching. Now, what's going on? What's the difference between these 2 examples? Well, there are 2 forces operating in different directions, and equilibrium will reflect the balance between those 2 forces. One force is that there is a difference between the two tasks. The managerial task is more sensitive to skill than the subordinate task, and so that means that you would always want to have a more skilled worker, all other things being equal, you would want to have a more skilled worker in the managerial task than in the subordinate task. That argues for exploiting differences between workers in how they're assigned to tasks. But if skill levels are too different, if there's too big a gap between the manager and the subordinates, the manager's high skill is sort of going to waste, because remember, the total output is this formula m squared s. If m is really big, that's still not going to produce very much output if s is really small. So you don't want the gap between m and s to be too big, and that's why in this example, the gap between 4 and 2 is just so big that you want to have homogeneous matching. So the moral of this story is the kind of matching that we get will depend on the distribution of available workers. Now, what does this have to do with inequality? Well, I want to do the same kind of thought experiments that I did with the theory of comparative advantage. That is, I want to look at the pattern of matching we would expect to have before international production becomes possible and after international production becomes possible. So let's, I'm going to be extremely concrete and assign specific numbers to the 4 skill levels. That again is not important, but it enables you, if you want, to check the slides that follow. I'll tell you a bit about the general results in a few minutes, but first let's imagine that these 4 values apply to A, B, C, and D. And let's look at what happens before international production becomes possible. What that means is that a worker in the rich country cannot be matched with a worker in the poor country. The only matchings that are possible are within countries. So, given the numbers that I wrote down, we're going to have cross-matching in the rich country and cross-matching in the poor country.
Is it because the skill levels becoming higher?
It's because the gap between 13 and 8 is not too big to make cross-matching profitable, and the gap between 6 and 4 is not too big to make cross-matching profitable. If those gaps were bigger, then we would get homogeneous matching, but I chose numbers where we get cross-matching. As I said, the general results don't depend on these particular numbers, because the general results involve lots of skill levels. So you can always have some cross-matching, because there will always be workers nearby. You have a continuum of skills. But in a four-type model like this, in order to get cross-matching, you can't choose the skill levels too far apart. So I didn't choose them too far apart. Any other questions? Yes.
For this non-continuous, does the distance have any sort of interesting interpretation? His conditions for distance?
Okay. Well, we're trying. I mean, you can. It turns out that given the output function, that the higher skill cannot be more than 1 plus the square root of 5 over 2 times the low skill to have cross-matching. But that's not what you were asking. Well, I think what you were asking is
Does 1 plus square root 5 over 2 have any interesting interpretation, I guess?
well. What does have an interesting interpretation? What we're trying to mirror here in theory is the fact that pre-globalization, the stylized firm in both rich countries and poor countries was a pretty heterogeneous firm. Think of the United States, for example, in the 1960s. In those days, a firm like General Motors, the biggest automaker, was the typical American firm. General Motors is a company which has very significant heterogeneity of skill. One of the I said that this is mostly theoretical work, but there is an empirical component which has gone to show that there has been a decline in heterogeneity of firms in both rich countries and poor countries. And so we chose numbers so that we would get heterogeneity pre-globalization as we saw heterogeneity in General Motors. So we have this pattern before globalization. Now, what happens after globalization? This is what we get. We get in the rich country, we get the A workers matching with other A workers, what I was calling homogeneous matching or self-matching. These companies are like Google or like Microsoft. Almost all the workers are very high skilled. We get an important degree of cross-country matching. So these are the people in the Indian call center who don't have some important skills, although they're not like these people, and they now are working for international companies. And we see the D workers who used to be matched with the C workers now left to their own devices. So this transformation is what I would argue is the stylized transformation that was brought about by globalization, the stylized transformation in production patterns. Now, what implications does this transformation have for wages and inequality? Well, we're assuming competitive labor markets. Before globalization, let's go back to this picture here. Before globalization, D workers were matched with C workers. That meant that the marginal product of a D worker was enhanced by the fact that he was working with C workers. You know from experience that if you're working with someone who is more skilled than you, that enhances your own productivity. And so D workers benefited from being matched with these higher skilled C workers. After globalization, the D workers are matched with other D workers. And so in this very stark example, we'll actually see a fall in D worker wages, which is something that has been observed empirically. Now, I'm not going to argue that this pattern is universally true, but it's been true enough to worry about heterolean where it can't happen. Now, what happened? So D workers' wages actually fall, or at least in less extreme examples, they don't rise very much. Yes.
Would it be, if you mentioned, I apologize, but would it be that in the rich country, B workers are left with B workers, and actually A workers are matched with C workers? It would seem to me that it would better reflect the reality.
Yes, and to some extent, we've had A workers matched with C workers. Now, it turns out that given the setup of this model, we cannot have A workers matched with C workers unless we also have B workers matched with C workers. It's a mathematical impossibility. That is, if it's desirable to match an A worker with a C worker, then it's also desirable. It's more desirable to match B workers with C workers than with themselves.
But at the same time, if you match A to C, then the gap will be bigger.
Right, but remember the gap. The gap cuts go both ways. You get if there's too big a gap, then the A workers are sort of going to waste. But on the other hand, you do want some gap because the manager's skill matters more. So you want more highly skilled workers as managers. So a gap, yes. Now I chose, going back to these numbers, I chose the numbers in such a way that the gap between A and C workers is in fact too big for these numbers to get cross-matching. But we could change that and have it would in equilibrium, but we would also have B workers matched with C workers. We would have both. Yes.
After the globalization, the first D worker and the second D worker, they have different wages because they have different positions, they have different productivities.
No, in equilibrium, all D workers have to be. Are you?
No. That image here, for example, in the very bottom on the right.
Yes.
The top one is the manager, so his productivity is.
Oh, no. Yes, no, it's true that they are occupying different positions, but in a competitive labor market, all workers of the same skill must be paid the same.
But their productivities are different. Because of their positions.
No, they aren't, because to measure productivity, you compare a worker with his next best opportunity. how much is he contributing? So on that definition, all D workers are the same. Yeah.
So, to this exactly, to this, you rise the managerial labor to the power of 2, while for a B worker who now is in a cross-matching, who before was a cross-matching with the A worker in his pre-trade country without an exponent of 2, so its productivity is different. Just like if I make the derivative really different. And if I pay accordingly the wages accordingly to my productivity level for each country, then they have different wage levels.
Yeah, but opportunity costs are equal. That's what he said actually.
But I'm not sure if I said this clearly. Let's look at this firm here. It's producing D cubed units of outputs. So that means that the wage of a D worker must be D cubed over 2. This is a model with constant returns to scale. And so in equilibrium, the profits will be 0. All revenue goes to the factors of production, which in this case are labor. Because all D workers are identical, they're going to be paid this, whether they're managers or subordinates.
Okay. Then there are different questions, because basically, and please correct me if I see it wrong, you're creating a kind of skill intensity reversal there, which is observed obviously in the empirical literature. But if I allow an Hector-Lean model for skill intensity reversals, I'm pretty sure that I will get very similar results from the inequality side.
I'm not sure
because
why you think Hector-Lean is going to produce the same inequality results.
There are some papers of Reeves 2007 who's doing this exactly in the Hector-Lean framework.
The papers that I'm familiar with do not, but perhaps later on you can show me which papers you mean. In any case, earlier I said that I suspected that Hector-Lean cannot account for the empirical reality, but I don't insist on that. If it can, great. If it can't, here's an alternative point of view. So coming back to wages, here we see that because of globalization, D workers' wages fall. What happens to C workers? Well, their wages actually rise because they now have an opportunity, a matching opportunity that they didn't have pre-globalization. They can now work with B workers. So we see D workers' wages fall, B workers' wages, C workers' wages rise, D workers' wages fall. That's an increase in inequality. So this is the main theoretical lesson of this production-oriented model of globalization. So what, yes, question.
In the first model, we only use demand and supply to determine wages of labor.
Right.
But can we use the same idea of matching for that first model and say that we have A and B labor in both countries before the trade between the two countries? A should be matched with each other to produce software, and B should be matched together to produce rice, the same in both countries. But now A's can be matched with B's in each country, and produce A and B matched to produce software in rich country, and A and B matched to produce rice in poor country. So
That's right. So what you're proposing is a merger between this model and the Heckscher-Ohlin model, and of course that would be more realistic, and it would still produce qualitatively similar results. The reason for doing this is to emphasize that the results on wages, the increase in inequality, is one which is due to matching and not due to international trade. So it's to isolate what is driving the result that we have simplified, oversimplified, if you like, the model.
I know the focus is not in rich countries, but what happens in rich countries because in the first model you mentioned that empirically we saw increasing inequality in the US, which was what the model predicts, but it's not clear because in the theory all countries should be better off after trading. At the same time,
On average, they're better.
On average,
Yeah.
it means that the relationship between GDP per capita and inequality would be going in different directions if you were rich at the before trade or not.
Yeah. So Heckscher-Ohlin predicts. Going back to the simple version of Heckscher-Ohlin, that predicts that inequality grows in the rich country and shrinks in the poor country. This theory predicts that inequality grows in the poor country, and the results for the rich country are actually ambiguous. It could go either way. It could increase. It could go down. So now, in fact, in a lot of rich countries, we have seen a pretty big increase in inequality too. It's not just the poor country. My subject today is poor countries, but actually Michael and I have another paper. In fact, it was the original paper. This came later, in which we tried to understand why inequality was increasing in rich countries. Now, the standard story, and this goes back to capital, is that technological advances have been biased in favor of highly skilled people. So in effect, their productivity has gone up even more. There may not have been a big change in skill, but there's been a big change in capital, and so that's had an effect on wages. We don't deny the importance of capital, but we felt that somehow there was a simpler story that could explain inequality, a story that doesn't need to invoke capital at all. And so So we have I don't want to get into the details today because it's a little bit off track, but in our story, it's a matching model, but of the domestic economy. And what we look at is what happens if there's a small increase in the dispersion of skills in rich countries. That's something that we've seen in over the last 20 years. An increase in dispersion of skills. That small increase in dispersion of skills can translate into a big increase in wages, even if you leave capital out of the story because matching changes. You're going to have less cross-matching and more homogeneous matching. This goes back to what I was saying about the typical American firm having gone from General Motors a generation ago to Microsoft on one extreme and McDonald's, say, on the other extreme. We see a more homogeneity within firms and more heterogeneity across firms. And we argue that this may be an even more fundamental reason for increased inequality in rich countries than the standard skill bias technological change story. We're not picking that up in this model because we're not looking at changes in skills within countries. We're keeping the skills constant. There were some other questions, I thought. Yeah, yes.
So I just want to get something, I just want to get a clarification. When you say B is greater than C, are you trying to say that low skills workers in developed countries are much more productive than high skilled workers in developing countries?
No. What I'm saying is that at least post-globalization, higher skilled workers will always be more productive than lower skilled workers. In this simple model, workers can be monotonically ranked. If you have more skill than someone else, your equilibrium wage has to be higher than that other person. And in fact, workers of equal skill will always be paid the same. The lesson to be drawn, however, is that those wages have changed in an important way since globalization occurred. Before globalization, D workers' wages were higher than they are post globalization. But it's always true that C workers will be paid more than D workers, and B workers will be paid more than C workers. A workers will be paid more than B workers. That's true all the time. Yes.
So just to summarize, so essentially the skill ranking is not, you're not indicating productivity, because productivity depends on the output, and you know how much output you produce depends on who you're paired with. So just the ranking of A being greater than B, being greater than C, being greater than D, I don't think you're saying anything about productivity except the skills and the distribution of skills between countries. And it is because of the production function that you've chosen, that it's M square S, how productive A and B are depends on who is available within that country to be matched with.
That's right.
So
that's right. You don't know in many simple trade stories. A worker's marginal product is A, what's the notation that's usually? Well, let's make it A. And so she's paid A. But in this model, we can't even compute a worker's marginal product until we know what the equilibrium matching pattern is. So it's a bit more complicated than the usual on the production side.
But I think this is a very simple and very indicative model of just the bare bones of what's going on.
Well, I hope so. I hope it's clear. This is obviously, we always want models to be simple because we can't. But Bob Solow is fond of saying that's the difference between reality and a model. You don't want a model to be too realistic because the world is too complicated to understand. Now this is super simplistic in the sense that I have left out important aspects of reality, and we would not want to try to empirically fit a model this simple, but I hope that at least theoretically you see what's going on, and then you can add the other more realistic elements. And suppose that we had an equilibrium matching configuration in which one of the A workers was matched with the other A worker, and the other A worker was matched with the B worker. Okay? So the question is, what would the wages be? Well, the outputs from this match is A cubed, A squared times A, and the output from this match, because we always want the higher skilled worker in the managerial job, is A squared B. Now, workers are paid their marginal product, which means that you have to look at how much the worker is getting paid relative to the next best opportunity. Given that we have given that we know that competition will force wages to be the same for all A workers. Why is that the case? Because if some A worker were paid less than some other A worker, it would always pay the firm to go after the one who was being paid less and pay him epsilon more to join his firm. So all A workers must be paid the same. And given that, we know how much these workers must be paid. They have to exhaust the entire profits of the firm, which is A cubed. So they get A cubed over 2. So that's the wage of the high skilled worker. Let me just finish the computation and then see if there are any questions left. Now, what about over here? Well, this worker must also get A cubed over 2 because I just argued that all A workers have to get the same wage. So this worker gets A cubed over 2. And what does the B worker get? The B worker gets the residual profits, which is a squared b minus a cubed over 2. So that's the formula for the b worker. And we've solved this example. The thing to emphasize about this example is that, and we can see this in the B worker's wage, that the B worker's wage depends very much on the equilibrium of the whole system, in particular the fact that there's a match between 2 A workers outside this firm. So unlike the even simpler models that I was referring to before, the usual kind of constant returns to scale model in which workers have constant marginal products. In this model, marginal product and therefore the wage of a worker will depend on the entire configuration of matching. So I hope this helps, but we can do some more computations if necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, this is all fine, but my concern is if A is a very big number, then the weight of W in this type of computation can be negative. How do you explain it?
No, it cannot be negative if, all right. So I'm assuming that in equilibrium, A is matched with B.
Yeah,
but that means that A cannot be too much bigger than B. Otherwise, it would not be a property of equilibrium that we would want to have.
So if A is so big, there will not be any match.
That's right.
But it means that A will receive nothing, but we must be indifferent between the other A's. So you cannot sustain the result.
This is a problem with integers. So as you may know, trying to do competitive theory with a small number of integers sometimes means that you have extra workers left over. That's a problem with a small example like this. But we could multiply. Let's multiply all of these people by some factor. Then that kind of problem doesn't arise.
Excuse me, but this example of computation of wages basically assumes that people are, like if these A workers pay based on their skills, not on their marginal productivity. Because it will be in the economy if there are, for example, unemployment, a higher level of employment for high-skilled workers, that, okay, those two guys and they matched, they both have high productivity, have high wage, but those unfortunate guy A, well, it was not matched with another A worker, it was matched with B. Like, why he should be paid the same wage as other high-paid A workers? He should basically be paid lower because he was less lucky in that economy. Or
the assumption underlying this model is a perfectly competitive labor market. If this worker were paid less than these workers, then it would pay the owner of this firm to go to this guy and say, why don't you work for me for less than this? Happy to do that because he is being paid less. And then the firm would fire one of these people and replace him with this guy. So the pure competition of the labor market rules out workers of the same skill being paid different amounts. Is that entirely realistic? No, of course not, because in reality, labor markets are not perfectly competitive. The reason for assuming it here is there is a certain degree of competition, and we don't want to ignore the competitiveness of the labor market altogether. Probably the labor market has got more competitive thanks to globalization. We now have competition across countries, not just within countries. And most important, we're trying to isolate where the increase in inequality is coming from. What is the critical factor in producing this increase in inequality? If we started assuming imperfections of the labor market, well, perhaps it's just an imperfect labor market that's giving rise to the effect. We feel that it's deeper than an imperfection in the labor market. So we're trying to make things as perfect as we can. And if we still get inequality, well, then that's something to concentrate on.
So I believe in the results that you got. So I'm not just concerned about the results that you get. But negative patients, can we change anything in the settings of this model to avoid such an inequality, to avoid inequality with globalization?
Okay, so I was just...
I have something to say about it, and
I was about to get to policy before I was told that we were supposed to have a break. Actually, it's a good thing we had a break. I think we're all better for it. But one thing I want to come to in just a few minutes is if we want to do something about inequality, and this is the world we live in, what should policy be? So, good question. Wait a couple minutes. What I'm mostly concerned about now is that the worries about wage competition be resolved. Does anyone want to see more about how wages are computed? Okay. So then let me get to policy. Well, one policy you could have, which would do something about inequality, is to try to stop globalization. So in this model, it was globalization itself which was increasing inequality. But of course, globalization does more than just increase inequality. It also increases per capita income in every country. If you do the per capita income computations in this model, just as in Heckscher-Ohlin, they go up as a result of globalization. So trying to stop globalization would be a pretty drastic way of trying to cure inequality, because you'd be interfering with average improvements. But something else you could do would be to try to raise the skill level of the D workers, the lowest skilled workers, enough so that they have international matching opportunities also. So let's go back to this picture. The reason why the D workers are being left to their own devices here is because the C workers have abandoned them and are now matched with the Bs. But if we move the skill level of the Ds up closer to something resembling Cs, we could imagine that the Ds would now be cross-matched as well, and they might be matched. They might be matched with Bs, or it might turn out that the C's now prefer, or I shouldn't say prefer, but the C's matched with D's actually work out to be a more profitable match in equilibrium than the C's matched with B's, but somewhere along the line, the D's would be matched with higher skilled workers if their skill level improves. This is actually this is a case where a continuum of skills makes it easier to see this point. If you have a continuum and you move the bottom part of the interval up, then you see that the new bottom people get to be matched with much higher skilled people than before. So that's a powerful way of counteracting the increase in inequality, to give D workers training or skill, some form of skill improvements. The problem, of course, is that this training doesn't come for free, and we have to ask, well, who's going to do it? Will the market do it, for example? Can we expect this to happen all by itself? And the answer is no. We're not going to see it done by the market, and there's some good reasons for that. First of all, suppose that I'm a company, a firm, hiring workers. Will it be in my interest to, when I'm hiring a D worker, to give that D worker education or skill training? And the answer is no, because if you hire me, if I'm a D worker and you hire me and you improve my education, now you're going to have to pay me more because I can go off and work for your competitor. The competitiveness of the labor markets means that any investment you make in my skill is at jeopardy because I can simply be hired by some other company, in which case you will have lost your investment in me. Now, of course, in reality, we see firms making some investment in skills in their work. They give workers some training. By and large, this is training which tends to be focused on the firm-specific tasks. This is training which is not always portable to some other company. In this model, all training is portable to other companies, and therefore we don't see producers investing in their workers at all. This is an extreme assumption, of course, and it doesn't cover the actual training that's done. But my point is that even if we modified the model to allow for some firm-specific skills, there would still be a bias against too little investment by firms in their workers relative to the problem of inequality. We would not expect to solve the inequality problem by firms investing in workers.
If the investment is done by the worker, as in Sven's story, would it change anything?
Yes. So a worker does have an incentive to invest in her own education because she gets the benefit. She gets paid her marginal product. The problem is we're talking about workers who can't afford to pay for education. So if these are relatively affluent workers, that will solve the problem. But the D workers are not affluent workers. And they can't borrow against their future earnings typically to pay for their current education. And so there's going to be insufficient investment there as well. So that means that the market will not solve the problem. And that means that someone else has to pay for the education. Now, who is this? Who is the third party? Well, it could be governments, domestic governments, and it often is. Although in most poor countries, not enough by far is done on this point. It could be NGOs, international agencies, like the World Bank, which have skill training programs in various countries around the world. It could come in the form of foreign aid from rich countries. It could even come from private foundations. And increasingly, it is coming from big private foundations. But the main point I want to make is that this is not a problem that we can expect market forces by themselves to solve, because the only party who has the incentive to do it are the very people who can't afford to do it, namely the workers.
I hope you can hear me. Let's assume that everything of that works out and all the D workers are raised in their educational level so that they will match with the C workers. So with whom do the B match then in the end? Do they match among themselves? And will this increase inequality in a rich country? Or is there a possibility that B, C, and D matches?
So you're saying let's raise the D skill level so they match with B or C?
No, with C.
With C.
Yeah.
Oh well, then
what happens then to B?
They might match with A now, or they might match with themselves. As I was saying before, the implications of this model for inequality in the rich country are not clear-cut. And that's even more the case if we start fiddling around with the skill levels in the poor country. That may or may not make workers in the rich country better off, and it may or may not increase inequality. It really all depends on the whole equilibrium. But as I was also saying before, Michael Primo and I, in another paper, have looked at. So one stylized fact is that rich countries have not been affected as much by globalization as poor countries. So China has made astounding success. India has made astounding success in their growth rates, mainly because of exports. The fact that they are now plugged into the global economy. Of course, rich countries have benefited from globalization too, but not nearly to the same extent. And so, to a first approximation, you could take a country like the U.S. and look at inequality in the U.S. as a primarily domestic phenomenon. And so in this other paper that Michael Kramer and I have, we look at it as a domestic phenomenon. Leave globalization out.
Thank you. I will look at this paper.
May I ask basically how your policy implication is related to the model? Because it seems to me that if we have inequality between the poor and richer people in the poor countries, it's quite intuitive and it can be generated by all sorts of models that if you help the unskilled people get more education, you will reduce the inequality. And then you talk about like the micro reasons why people don't take efficient level of skills, and that it's because they are credit constraints, and then there can be micro evidence on whether this is actually true or it's actually about lower returns to schooling. But I don't really see a kind of the trade model is very interesting as description of the patterns and global trade, etc. Or not trade in this case, but I don't see how it actually relates to the policy implication about education or the added value is, or the interaction seems orthogonal.
Well, again, let's contrast this model with the classical Heckscher-Ohlin model, where without any policy at all, without intervening in the market at all, we expect an increase in trade to reduce the inequality in a poor country. So, which, as we saw before, means that wages of unskilled workers will rise as a result. So there, in a model like that, the implication is not to give low-skilled workers more training. The policy intervention, if any, is to free up markets and allow more international trade, and that by itself is going to solve the problem. I don't think it's right that I don't think the premise is correct that all models lead to the policy implication of more education and job training. Some do. This is not the only one, but the most classic model of all of international trade, the model going back to Ricardo, at least in its simple form, doesn't have this implication at all. It has the implication that we don't need to do anything special for low-skilled workers other than free up markets. And it was, you know, that was the argument that it was the classical argument that was made in Mexico, for example, when Mexico signed NAFTA. It was the expectation that trade with North America, freer trade with North America, would improve low-skilled workers. The evidence suggests that that didn't happen, and it's because the expectation was not met that we have to look at a model like this, which has a rather different policy implication.
This situation correlates with what happened to nation countries such as, for example, China, and we see that national companies relocate their production to, for example, Mexico or other, or if we speak about automobile industry, or for example, to Bangladesh or some of them think about Myanmar or some countries like that. So they seek for, anyway, they seek for unskilled workers, and they seek for, lower paid workers. Do you expect that it is possible to educate all the people in the world, to hire their skills and that, in that regard to hire their level? And if yes, so then what happens? I don't think that in the short term this such policies help, because it might be that people, so for example, if their skills become better, so they look for bigger salaries, they just might lose work, and they will have to retrain because they won't be needed, or to migrate.
I think we have to be clear about which workers we're talking about. We're talking about D workers, and the interval between D and C workers are the people we're talking about. International companies are looking for workers in that interval like crazy these days. I mean, the fact that they're going from one country to another to seek out those workers suggests that these workers are being employed faster than they can be educated. So I do think there could be quite a significant short-run effect, or at least medium-term effects, by putting people in the position of being employable by global markets. Remember, we're talking about people who are currently out of the global economy altogether, and we're just putting them up to the point. We're not making them rich.
In the long run, when, for example, these people will become more skilled, so what happens? Are they to change to retrain or what? When they are already not needed, when international companies, for example, don't want to push that level, but they think that, as in China, it happens.
Well, in China, it's still the case that many companies would love to have.
But they relocate anyway. They go from the higher paid, even in China itself, they relocate from the higher paid regions to the lower paid regions. So these people who work in the higher paid regions, what happens to them? Are they fired?
We're coming back to the question of how perfect the labor market is. So in this model, we have a perfectly competitive labor market. There's no such thing in this model of a higher paid region and a lower paid region, because it doesn't really matter in this model where people live. They can equally well be employed no matter where they are in the world. Now, you're pointing out that in reality there are.
I'm trying to apply it to that.
Yes, I'm interested in applying it to reality as well. We know that the labor market is not currently as idealized as this, but I think we can expect, given the trends we've seen, that it's going to become more like this. decline in communication costs, for example, can be expected to continue. And with decline in communication costs, it's going to matter less and less where workers physically live, which means that it will matter more and more what their skills are relative to the global market, not just relative to the particular region where they live.
How this output in the middle companies to firms as really B and C will be divided between rich and poor countries. Because as I see, if B managers are from rich countries and their output will go to rich countries, so and we leave poor countries only with C. So that's increasing international.
So these B workers work for some international firm, but they still live in the rich country. And these C workers work for an international firm, but they still live in the poor country. So the B workers' income should be counted as rich country income, and the C workers' income should be counted as poor country income. That's the way the accounting is done here. And if using that accounting, you can check that both countries' incomes go up as a result of globalization.
Sir, I would like to also abstract a bit from the model and come to a more practical application. So as far as I see it, the ultimate conclusion of this model is that if country wants to be, let me say in general, be better matched with more advanced world, its ultimate objective should be human capital, like investing and developing of its human capital. But you know that like if country develops human capital, also like structural changes in one of the previous questions. So like structural changes should happen in the economy for its more developed human capital to be actually employed and start working and start bringing economic benefit. For example, like may often like Russia may be one of the examples where the level of education is very high and the level of human capital is at least some part of it is very high, but it's just not being employed within the economy. So the question is, so these people, if government, for example, intentionally starts to invest in human capital and to increase it, then this human capital may be tempted just to leave the country when employment offers from employers are better. How personally would you evaluate the policy if government, for example, on the one hand invested in education of people, but on the other hand made it binding to stay within the economy, not to leave the country? Because on the one hand it will bring economic benefit to the country, on the other hand it's a moral problem of rejecting personal freedom.
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think few economists would favor restrictions such as the one you're proposing as long-term solutions. Some might agree that as a temporary measure, just as we might have temporary controls on capital in a crisis. We don't allow unlimited transfers of capital out of the country. So some people might argue that as a temporary measure, restrictions on immigration might be desirable. There are arguments. There are arguments on both sides, and how it comes down in particular cases, I think, would depend on the details of those cases. But in principle, I can see that there may be reasonable restrictions, temporary restrictions of that kind. So for example, quite a number of countries offer scholarships to students who go abroad to study for a few years, perhaps to pick up some technical skill. Often a string attached to such a scholarship is that you come back to your country of origin for a limited number of years. You're not bound there forever, but you're expected to come back, contribute something to your country for, say, 3 years.